I am Marc Shirley. I'm a partner at B2B CFO, been with B2B CFO for about 10 years. We serve, I guess it's over 10 years. We serve owners of privately held companies. We're strategic business advisors. We tell them, the reason to bring us in is if you want more cash, maybe in the bank account or to go on vacation, or maybe not worry about when your receivables are due. My background before B2B CFO, I had a 26-year career with Procter & Gamble, and I'm a graduate of the University of Notre Dame with an MBA. I'll give it to Greg.
Right. My name is Greg Baugh. I have an executive search firm, GSB Search. It has been and I've been doing recruiting for about 29 years. Prior to that, as I tell people, I did do my penance in public and private accounting for 5 years. Did pass that CPA exam. And I also then proceeded to go on and got my MBA from the Regent Center here at the University of Kansas. Basically the biggest change in my business, I actually now I can actually say we now, because I do have a team. So we've got a really, I've got they were 2 part-time assistants last year, and one of them went full-time here at the beginning of the year. So we're really excited about 2023. And by the way, just for anybody talking about that R word that's out there, we have determined at GSB Search that if there is a recession, we are not participating. Just for the record.
Kansas City's not.
Yeah, we're not participating.
Good evening, Jim Fee. I am currently doing fractional CFO, COO work as well as advisory work on my own. I've got a background of owning and running my own companies. I've owned 5 different companies and been CEO of each of those. Prior to that, I worked in large corporate. I was co-CFO at Dairy Farmers of America and responsible for strategy, corporate development, M&A, internal audit, treasury management, bank and investor relations, and 5 business units, P&L responsibility for 5 business units. And I guess the last thing I did is I built 2 plants while we were there. Prior to that, I was at Sprint. I ran a business unit at Sprint before going over to corporate and doing merger and acquisition work. And I had an investment banking background before working at Sprint. Sprint was a client of mine, and I got hired by them to start a business unit. I've got an undergraduate degree in industrial engineering from the United States Naval Academy and an MBA from Rockhurst University.
Yeah, impressive. Thank you for your service.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, guys. So why are we having this topic? And it basically is because, at least in my experience, I help a lot of small businesses and companies, three to $20 million range. And I bump into a lot of CFOs. And it's a challenge for me, because I find they're pretty much accountants. And I guess it's an opportunity for me, because if they're accountants, they need CFO services. But I think that there's a lot of confusion in the market as to what a CFO versus a controller is. And I thought we would have fun tonight talking about it. We hope to make this interactive. If you're online, you can type any questions you have into there's a chat box there, and we'll keep an eye on it, and we'll share those things. If you're here, of course, you might have to scooch up to get into the mic, but let's have a conversation about what you're seeing in the market, how you feel about this. Is it the same position from your perspective? I don't know, but when I read, I've got a dozen definitions, but let me read the one that I think is somewhat the clearest. Through the responsibility of the CFO, the responsibility of the CFO is to overlook everything related to finance. His primary or her primary role is to make forward-looking budgeting, projections, planning, and other forward-looking financial strategies. The definition of a controller is responsible for approving all day-to-day transactions within the organization and creating recurring and monthly reports. Its functions also include keeping track of all accounts receivables and payables. Okay. So forward-looking, and as we used to say when I was in grad school, or bayoneting the dead, right? As an accounting firm. But I'm gonna have some questions for guys, and they're no surprise, so they should be at least had a chance to think about them. So
What you might do is, how about you have them read the question, so you can state it here, but and then read the question to
Okay.
everybody there.
just work through it. That makes moderating a lot easier.
That way you're not passing.
Okay, I guess I'm first.
We have a new moderator.
We have multiple moderators and, dual roles. I know you guys aren't used to that at all.
So I'm talking question A here. Is that, okay.
I just did the first definition.
Yeah, so here's the first question. And I think I'll answer and then I'll pass the mic and make sure we get all the perspective. The first question is, do you think the market understands these definitions? My perspective is no. If you're thinking of the market as a business owner in that small to medium sized business, they have very little idea of the distinction between CFO and controller. They may think that the right thing to do is to hire a really good accountant, and part of their motivation is to provide that CFO title. And then there's a whole idea whether they're going to have somebody that talks to the bank and they want that CFO title, but they really don't, they're not in the weeds on what the difference is. Now, I will say, you do run into some that do get it. I've had an engagement where I was hired specifically to help train someone from a controller position who is super competent. And the owner wanted something more. And he decided he'd invest in this person versus, and she wanted to, she wide open. I mean, her first conversation is this type of thing you want to do? And that worked actually very well. We're actually going to have a reconnect sometime in the next couple of weeks, it's been about 6 months after the engagement. It's been great. So that's my perspective on it. I'll pass it on to Greg.
Yeah, my first pause when Mark called was, okay, why do you want me on the panel? I've never been a controller. I've never been a CFO, but I have been talking to a few controllers and a few CFOs for 29 years. As I mentioned, it started in my background in public and private accounting. I was, worked directly with controllers and CFOs at Butler Manufacturing where I worked. But to prepare for this, a couple of people even are online, Lee, Paul, talked to Augie a little bit the other day about this. I went out and called a lot of my, network over the last few days just to get their perspective. So I'm kind of conveying what other people have said. And, the forward-looking versus, historical perspective, controller is more the historical, what happened, show us the reports for what happened. And the CFO is much more on the forward-looking side. I will go back to something that I saw early in my career, is that sometimes when companies go out there and have a definition or they want to hire somebody, and I see this on the backside, i.e. a candidate that went into a company and the expectations were not, I thought I was going to come in here and be your strategic partner, CFO type. And I always said that people need to be cautious when they go into companies, because so many business owners, they want two numbers out of that position when they hire it for the first time. How much money do I have in the bank at the end of the year? And how much do I owe in taxes? They're looking for a bookkeeper. And that's not the job that you're looking for as a financial professional. So, but going back to the controller CFO, it's just that forward-looking versus that rear, historical perspective. And not everybody that's a controller can make that next step. They don't have the financial, acumen or desire to do it. So I have another definition I'll save for later.
I agree with Greg and Mark that I don't think the market really understands the difference when you get down into the lower middle market and even the small market and the lower middle market. I think once you get a little bit larger size, probably up around 150 million in revenue, they tend to notice a difference. And they understand that their controller is preparing financial statements for the bank. They're backward looking in a lot of ways. And one of the things that I've found with companies that I have worked with that don't have a CFO, that have a controller, if they've got any financial issues going on at all, their bank is telling them they're blowing their covenants, and they decide we need a CFO to start being strategic and be a little bit more forward looking versus let's reconcile the accounts and tell us what you're doing. And I think that's the big difference. As both Mark and Greg have said, it's backward looking, or today, and let's just pay our bills, versus let's be a strategic partner for the business owner, the CEO, the management team, and really be part of the management team deciding the direction to go. CFO is going to be reviewing financial statements, and they are going to be doing some important things like forecasting cash flow, but they're also going to be out there and setting the goals and objectives for the business, or helping set those goals and objectives and determining what direction to go. And that's going to create that money in the bank for the business owner or owners.
So Mark, why don't you pass the questions?
Yeah,
down and
you take the
so
next
that-
Oh, okay.
Spread it.
Next question is, do you think the CFO title is overused in the marketplace? And I definitely think that's a very true statement, because, and it goes back to the fact that a lot of the people that are looking for CFOs or looking for controllers don't know the difference, and the CFO sounds better. Sounds like they're going to attract a higher quality of person, or maybe more experienced person is the way I should say it. And but it is a different skill set. And so I find all too often in the small to middle market, the controller, the CFO terms are interchangeable to the people that are running the business and looking to fill a position. And therefore they get overused. I think, Mark, you may have said it early on, or Greg, that they'll throw that CFO title out there as a carrot to attract somebody when they're recruiting. And it really does need to be defined, and there is a difference in the marketplace.
And I think one of the things that kind of comes out of that too is kind of that expectation. If you put somebody in that has CFO skills, that wants to be forward looking, and you give them that title, and then all they have time to do then is just to keep up on the books, keep up on the financials and stuff, controller type responsibilities. That's where you end up with a situation where the expectation is totally blown. And that's why mistitling is so critical, or it's a problem. And going back to just a statement of the obvious, when you think about this, and I don't know if everybody would agree with this, if you bring in somebody to an organization that is very strategic, that is a CFO, and you don't have a good controller or good accounting systems, you're screwed. The controller is the least common denominator we have to have. We have to have the accounting done. And if you're so small, and don't have that person, you outsource it to, a bookkeeping Fortivity or some other bookkeeping service or something. So.
What's the difference in the payroll?
Comp ranges.
Oh yeah, repeat the question.
So yeah, what's the difference in the comp ranges? So this is an interesting topic. We were talking about this the other day, because I've had on my desk in the last 12 months, people that tried basically in the initial meeting said, yeah, this is a controller role. And the salary ranges have ranged from 80K to 175K. And here's the problem. The 80K to 90K, 100K was not a controller job. It was an accounting manager job by any definition in the book, when you started looking at the duties, responsibilities, and criteria. Because it just isn't. I mean, you're 2, 3, 4 year senior accountants are getting paid 70, 80K right now. So yeah, if you can find them. So that's the pay difference. And then, and I've definitely seen some appropriately priced, you can have solid controller roles underneath a top finance person with a CFO that are basically in that 120 to 200 range. And of course, larger companies could have a 200+K corporate controller if you're getting into revenues of probably 400 or 500 million and above. but that's kind of what I'm seeing in the market.
So I have very little to add to that. So I'm going to go a different route. It screws up my business development. I've got CFO in the name of my company, right? So you introduce yourself as a partner with B2B CFO, and, you know, heaven forbid I use that fractional CFO kind of title, because they'll go, oh, so you're going to do my books? It's a challenge to communicate to people what the difference is and what value you can bring. It's best to just go understand their problems and then provide the solution, whether sometimes it is they need a controller before you can do anything. So very good. I'll go to the next question, because I like this one. This is a really good one. Do you think it makes sense to require a CPA? How many people here are CPAs?
Not active, but.
Okay, so I got 3, and notice it's the recruiter guy. Right?
Yeah, it's the recruiter.
It's not me. So I'm a little bit biased there. It has not, I was discouraged early in my career. You know, when I came out of graduate school, I was about to do that and I was discouraged. You won't do anything for your career. And a couple of times I've thought, gosh, I would have liked to have those 3 letters, but I don't think it's really made a difference in that situation. And truly the CPA, I mean, in my practice, I want to make sure I have a CPA involved and somebody who is knowledgeable and really competent about the tax planning side. Yeah, it's tax, not bookkeeping, but the tax side. But I really want somebody I can lean on. So it is important to have that, but that's not typically what I think of as the role of the CFO or controller.
I like this topic too. Because there are companies and organizations that are looking for that being a criteria, that have a valid reason for looking for it, but more times than not, they can't tell you why, because that's a question I'll ask them. You know, if it's general, I won't go into specifics, but I'll basically do that talk track. Okay, great. You say on the job description that you're requiring a CPA required. Can you answer me a couple questions as to why you want that? And they really don't know. And if they don't know, but in talking to some of the people that I've talked to recently, I addressed that specific question because I talked to a handful of people that never did do public and are at a CFO level. And I talked to several that had that in their backgrounds. And, you know, I feel like that if you're talking about a fairly large publicly traded company and you're talking about somebody's, you know, not necessarily it's the stepping stones to get to the controller or CFO role, those are the people that it's probably pretty valid that they're not hiring them because of the 3 letters behind their name, because plenty of people have those 3 letters. They're actually looking for, when they say CPA, they're looking for the people that have had a lot of exposure to technical accounting questions in a variety of audit situations. And the second thing they're looking for there is that it's a rite of passage from a standpoint that you're getting a pre-screened person that has been working 70 to 90 hours a week for a couple of years. Oh, believe me, some of them do it more because of the staffing.
Do they do that anymore?
Yeah, they still work a lot of hours. They've gotten better in some respects. But from the standpoint of, yes, early career, it's probably a rite of passage. There's some, you know, you get maybe a few more interviews because people say they need it. But in the grand scheme of things, it's what you actually can do. And if you learn it some other way, passing a test isn't going to make that big of a difference.
So I don't think that you need to have a CPA to be a CFO, definitely, to be strategic thinking. In some cases, maybe it helps from a controller standpoint, depends upon what type of business it is, what type of tax implications. Do you have a VP of tax or somebody doing that? Are you outsourcing all of that? What I find that most companies, and here again, it's the lower end of the middle market to the middle market, they put CPA down in their job descriptions just because I think it's something they're not sure what they're getting with the CPA, but it's something to add to that job description. And then you go in and like Greg was saying, he's doing it on the recruiting end, where I've been in with companies before, and you start talking about, do you need that CPA or not? They're not sure what the CPA gets them. And so it's an education thing. I definitely think CPAs have their role, but to be strategic, to look at, I think most people that have worked their way up to a controller or a CFO have a general understanding of accounting and accounting principles and tax in most cases, and they understand what they need to do from a cash flow perspective, which is where it becomes really, really important and forward-looking and strategic when it becomes to a CFO. So my short answer to that is no, you probably don't need that.
I'll add one more quick thing to that too. The one more quick thing that I'd add to that is I've had this theory, it's purely a hunch and through observation, is that why CPA is often required is because so many of our CFOs in the Kansas City market didn't come from iBanking or anything, because we're not a money center. They came from the big four, the large regional firms. What do people hire? They hire people in their own image. The CFO, he or she tends to know what they got experienced in public accounting, and they tend to mimic that when they're looking at, oh, I've got to get somebody, going back to the good work ethic and all that stuff. So that's why I see it happen.
I've done the same thing. Just a comment, I guess, for the recruiting aspect, in working with turning around troubled manufacturing companies, that I've found some controllers that were really over their skis trying to understand CapEx budgeting, actually trying to get their hands around cash flow. But then I asked, how did you get your current incumbent? They had the CPA, they're great for GAAP reporting, but they couldn't do anything strategic. And they said, well, it was on the advice of our auditor. And they, yeah, and they preferred if we would take one of their people that weren't quite fitting in their organization currently.
I think they call that a dumping ground.
I see that all the time. Okay, let me make my little off the cuff commentary. What does it mean if after an interview they tell you we would have hired you if you had a CPA?
This means they don't like you.
That it means absolutely nothing.
It means the accounting, the hiring manager, hypothetical, the controller, let's say it's a lower level position. The controller was told by their boss, hire a CPA.
Well,
if they hire somebody that's not a CPA and they don't work
but-
out,
but Greg, my resume, if I'm in that situation, didn't have CPA on it before I went in for an interview.
Right.
They knew you weren't a CPA from the beginning. It's the same. It's the Matt Budd thing. If they tell you anything, it doesn't mean anything. They might as well say the wind was blowing from the west that day. We don't want to hire you. It means absolutely nothing. I had a friend get that excuse 3 times, and he was in his 40s, and he went back and studied for the CPA exam and killed himself to get it. Can you imagine? I mean, I couldn't do it again. So I just want to make that point is your resume tells them what you are.
What you are.
Yeah, why you are and what you are.
You know what CPA means later in life. It's can't pass again. CPA later in life means can't pass again.
I do. It's from Chris, and I'm hoping oh, good. So he gave me a little clarification. So the question comes out: do you see the problem with startups and with fast ramp ups? Think of examples like fast growing companies get into trouble from lack of having both an accountant, controller or such, and a CFO. And then things go off the rail. A good example that comes to mind is the mess that WeWork was when it came to going public. The books were a disaster. I doubt the company had a controller. The VCs were guilty Also because they lost control of what was going on, deferring to the CEO founder. Wow. Okay. So I know Chris is laughing now. You know,
The idea of startups, often I see this problem where you'll realize quickly that they're losing control because they're either focused on, let's bring in the CFO so we can raise money. So they're always thinking about raising money, and then they forget what's really going on behind the scenes, and things start rapidly declining.
right. So now we're going, so to some degree, so I can't really speak to this because I kind of avoid startups. My wife won't let me have hobbies. So it's not been good. It's not been an area that I've gone. So I'm going to see if somebody else has more experience, but I do get, I mean, I have walked into several companies where I would say the focus has not been on what, accurate and timely financial statements. And then, especially if they have some sort of debt or stakeholders that are wanting accountability, it becomes a huge mess. And that really is, that shows, who was it said least common denominator needs to be the controller. There is that big missing link, but I don't have the startup experience. I bet Jim, yeah.
Jim does.
Well,
Go, Jim.
so I think the startup, if you're growing that fast, if you're talking about going public, and I've taken companies public before as an investment banker, you better have an outside auditor because nobody's going to trust internal books on anything. And you better have an independent third party reviewing everything before you think you're going to go public. And you better do it for several years before you think you're going to go public. So internal, external, if your books are a mess and you're trying to go public, then you're not going to get it's not going to be a very successful offering. I think that rapidly growing startups probably do need a CFO and a controller. They need to have their accounting systems in place, whether that CFO and or controller or a CPA or not. You've got to have good bookkeeping. You've got to have processes and procedures that are core to fundamental a good finance organization in any type of business. And you've got to keep your records. I think that a startup rapidly growing, if you've got a CFO that can work as a strategic partner with the founder, CEO, work with early stage investors, work with banks. I think that's extremely important from a CFO perspective, but you still need that controller, bookkeeper, proper accounting systems in place to be able to be successful as you go forward.
Well, and from an experience standpoint of seeing people that have gone through that before, what I've often seen, that's where you do see often somebody that maybe came from an accounting background, like the Big Four or something, that is truly doing the strategic side of that, but they're also doing the accounting side. They are wearing both hats. What we talked about earlier, you can have controllers that have CFO titles, but they're really not a CFO. They're not doing the strategic, but you can, and you will see, because there's a big payday someday with a growth startup, you'll see a CFO truly doing the controller role, or they're hiring maybe staff accountants, senior accountants to, literally crunch the numbers for them if they're too busy. But the fact of the matter is, in that kind of an environment, they're probably working 70, 80, 90 hours a week to get that done. If they don't feel like they're ready to have 200K plus officers in the company on the finance accounting side.
And I would add to that CFO better be there looking over those numbers and reviewing everything as part of his or her responsibilities. And making sure that whether it's a controller, a senior accountant, a bookkeeper, whoever it may be, is following the processes and procedures, and everything is categorized correctly.
Do we have any more?
Done with it.
I
We're
think
done with the written. We're on
audience
to the
questions. Audience questions.
Okay, was that all the questions? questions?
I think that was the
Anybody
question.
have any other comments, thoughts?
I'm checking on the chat too.
Chris looks like he's waving his hand. So
Chris?
I got a different question, and it's based on when I used to be in investing. I was a corporate bond investor analyst. And the things that I always saw, of course, were the SEC filings put together by controllers, put together by CFOs. And then sometimes you'd wake up and there was fraud, from various causes. But how do you guys view the dynamic that goes on in public companies between CFOs and controllers? Because there seems to be, there's some kind of tug and pull always going on, I think. I'm guessing.
Well, yeah, so Marc,
Just to expand a little further, the person I would see all the time at meetings, et cetera, or here on the phone, nowadays Zoom, would be a CFO and CEO. And so the CFO is reciting the financials and reciting some of the accounting issues, but it's really a controller, of course, in a large public company conducting everything behind the scenes. But then you wake up one day and there's fraud and you go, okay, what that kind of dynamic, just wondering, everything isn't a fraud, but there's definitely a tug and pull that must go on all the time.
you want, I can give a little bit. So I'm 10 years out of public. Everything I do is with private now, but I saw dynamics and actually had controller responsibilities within a large corporate organization, but not the corporate controller. And then there was something that comes to mind, Sarbanes-Oxley or something like that. I have a feeling that I really expected that CFO to understand whether the systems were making sure he had the right information or not. I mean, you have to, hold it up. Okay. Okay. So part of, fraud has to do with whether or not you have the right controls in place. Of course, there can always be, multiple people, but if you really have the right systems and the right culture, and then a CFO who owns that, I mean, ultimately it's all on them. So I have no problem with the CFO reciting the numbers because he owns it. He should have it. But that's a very, I mean, I have not experienced the organization I grew up in. When I started there, it was the corporate controller that gave us the speech. And some of it was about writing. And he said, we're never going to have something show up on the first front page of the Wall Street Journal that we had to restate. So that was kind of the shot over the bow, if you would.
Passing this right past me because I have nothing to add to that subject. I'm out on that one.
So, yeah, I've never experienced a great deal of conflict between controllers and CFOs in my career. Controller generally works for the CFO. The CFO is the chief financial officer of the organization. He or she is responsible for everything that is put out, whether it's a public or a privately traded company. And he's the leader of that finance organization. And so the controller is under his leadership, and if something's wrong, it's going to be the CFO's fault on a public in a public environment. He may address that with the controller in a private setting, but that's, I just haven't ever seen that conflict. And I have been involved in a rather large fraud case as an investment banker, a publicly traded company. And it was a CFO that ended up keeping two sets of books. And it was one where we were doing a securitization and had to do an extremely difficult amount of due diligence on a finance company, and found a separate set of books. And the controller, don't know if he was not sure. He ended up going to jail. The CFO committed suicide. The CEO went to jail. But I mean, they were all complicit in there, whether they knew what was going on or not. And, you know, that was the CEO and CFO that were ultimately responsible.
Find the second set of books.
Yes, behind the second set of books, and several years worth of falsified financial statements that were reported publicly. This was a publicly traded company. And had they not tried to do their first ever asset securitization, it may have gone on for a lot longer. CapMac, I don't know if they're still around even, probably not, to provide the insurance for that AAA rated portion of the bond, was the one that discovered it.
Yeah, I just have to chime in. Mark said it earlier, that the whole fraud thing is cultural. It's cultural for me. I mean, a couple of years ago, before I was the chairman of this group, we were meeting with the prior chairman, and we were going around the room saying, what do you want to do? And I want to be a CFO, I want to be a CFO, I want to be a CFO. It came to me, I go, I want to be a CFO. They go, well, why in the world wouldn't you want to be a CFO? And my answer was, I'm tired of making good numbers better. Because that's your job all the time. It's just stretch it, push it to the next level. Especially if it's publicly traded or big enough to have bank issues, because they want better numbers. And that's not what I like to do. I mean, it's just the way it is.
Before we wrap up, there was one other comment that I remember that came up as a little bit of a theme between 2 or 3 different people that I spoke with, that I think was very, just enlightening about that difference between the CFO and the controller, kind of going back even to our first question. And they just talked about how the CFO tends to have relationships with across the management spectrum compared to the corporate controllers. Controllers so busy, they don't even necessarily have that much time. Let's say that they don't have good relationships, but the CFO takes the time, makes the time of finding out, and is helping the person on the manufacturing side do their forecast, helping them get, approach them about the strategy of the business. And that was just an insight that I thought was very valuable. Earlier in the year, this had nothing to do with this round of talking to people, but I did hear one other definition of the difference between a corporate controller and a controller and a CFO.
I can't hardly wait.
The CFO looks at the numbers to the left of the comma. The controller looks to the numbers to the right of the decimal. So
I like it.
only accounting and finance people would find that funny.
That's hilarious. Oh, my goodness. Any other comments from the group?
Any other comments?
I just appreciate.
Could I just ask a question specific?
Pardon. I appreciate the questions about fraud, and in turning around manufacturing companies, sometimes the big challenge is, one, they didn't know the numbers, but 2, the amount of internal theft. Sometimes there's embedded internal theft rings, and sometimes they've gotten in cahoots with. Now, I didn't think the person was qualified to be a controller, but they had the title VP of Finance and called themselves CFO. As back to Chris's thing about relationships, the testy relationship when you're brought in as an interim general manager, COO, but you're running it, and you find out you have a corrupt CFO. One, the incumbent audit firm does not want to help you. They would just as soon not pay attention, and they'll sometimes obfuscate. It can be the difficulties of getting information can be compounded if IT reports to accounting, which is not a good
I
relationship.
hate the newsletter. I am having problems with it.
But as you start looking into it, I have found that bringing in a firm that may or may not do a test services, but they are
Yeah,
not.
no, I do,
Right.
but for some reason, and I had this one
And you
other
start to
time
get
and I
the
forget how
IT,
to.
you start to look into the IT, you can get the definitive information that shows where the embezzlement and fraud has occurred. Now, the outside group you bring in to do that investigative work, they will not give you a report in writing, because their concern is if somebody's been stealing frequently after they get caught, they sue whoever called them out. And that can go on for 4 or 5 years. Ultimately, you prevail, but who needs that unbillable time? But just commenting, as far as testy relationships, maybe one of the more challenging one you'll see is trying to get a corrupt CFO or controller out after they've gotten embedded.
So Isaac, you want to ask your question?
Yes, first, just thank you for the discussion. Very helpful and insightful. I appreciate everyone's time this evening. Just maybe a quick question. I am currently looking at an opportunity, and a question touched on an issue that I'm looking at specifically, and it is in a rapid growth company. They're in the material handling, equipment, sales, and leasing industry. And they're roughly in the 70 to 80 million, but soon to double through acquisition. Not currently a controller in place, and looking at bringing in, a CFO, which is the role that I'm applying for, and I've served in assistant controller, and now treasury, oversee the treasury for companies both smaller and quite a bit larger than this one. Just curious, any words of advice or warning in this situation? Because I think I would be in that role where I think they want to tool up to be able to handle the acquisitions. That makes sense to me, but systems controls are definitely, probably need to be patched up. So I'll probably be doing, more of a controller role initially. Any thoughts on this? Words of advice?
Yeah, I'm gonna give it to Greg.
Yeah.
Okay. there you go.
Definitely, right, yeah, be know what you're getting into. No, what I would look at, so there's obviously questions you can directly ask them and make sure they can answer them, but there's actually even somewhat public information in the sense that most organization or most professionals out there are on LinkedIn. What you want to find out is what is the infrastructure. If they don't have a controller right now, historically, did they have a controller? Was there just an accounting manager there? What do they have in place right now? Because it goes back to what we were talking about earlier. If they're really on that kind of a growth curve, are they willing, and do they have the capital to do this? They need to be having a staff for a double that size business now, not a year from now. In other words, they need to staff up from that standpoint. And what you find sometimes is they're trying to be penny wise and pound foolish by not staffing up, and then you're just chasing your tail and you're not being able to be strategic.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, I don't think I don't get the sense that they're being penny wise, but I may need to press for that, sort of backfill of staff. They had I think it's a classic kind of growth company. They had a sort of controller, sort of CFO role, but it didn't quite fill the need of either. So,
and if you want to do your due diligence, seriously, I don't know how old this company is, but I've told people to go on LinkedIn, find out past people that work there and pick up the phone, go on LinkedIn, go reach out to them, find out what the culture's like, find out why they left.
yeah.
And the FENG database, you can search that for that company
Wow.
and see who used to work there, if there are FENG members.
Okay.
You may also want to check with the company you're acquiring, because you want to know if somebody knows anything good or bad about that company. So
Yeah.
suddenly you're part of it. Someone else is doing the due diligence, I assume, right now, but
Right.
you can get ahead of the curve. That can help.
Ready?
Yep. I think we're out of time. Really appreciate. Thank you, Mark, Greg, Jim, for your time. Thank you all that were online. Thank you, Charlotte, for